Guten Tag, Daniel.
What are we, German today?
I mean, I'm part German. My last name's Yerger. But no, one of our applicants' cover letters came addressed to Guten Tag and hiring team, and then ended with Auf Wiedersehen. So it's a mood, apparently.
All right, fair enough, I suppose. Well, topics for the week. I want to talk about how and why financial plans fail, why rules of thumb don't always work, and why chasing the perfect financial plan can be a futile exercise.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, really just talking about how, like, the mechanics of plans. How do we make it all come together, or be more successful, and maybe what undermines that? Is that sort of the theme we're going for today?
That's the theme we're going for today.
All right, carry on.
Okay. So first and foremost, whether somebody has professional help or not, I really just want to talk about why plans fail, right? We've worked with enough families and individuals at this point to pick apart some themes and, consistent things that come up that cause plans to, be less than desirable for some families. I want to dive into a couple of them, but are there any that come to mind for you specifically when I say that?
I think the easiest way to frame this is to think about how we think about something like the ability to retire or the timeline to retire. So what we like to say is, look, if you want to retire sooner or later, if you want to have a certain quality of life, so on and so forth, then there's only a couple levers we can kind of push and pull. The financial planner's joke is that anybody in America can retire. It's just a question of timing and quality of life. And in that context, what's going to cause a lot of problems to sort of fail or collapse or not function correctly is going to be a misalignment of the variables that go into it. So there's going to be a kind of the most fundamental variable, which is your cost of living, right? If my cost of living is too high, it's not affordable, I have to save more or get more return or something like that to fund it, or I have to work longer and save longer and then need less funding for that to work. So it can really be basic problems such as undersaving. It can be a problem such as overspending relative to how much we've saved, right? My quality of life, my cost of living is too high relative to the financial means that I've built up to make it work. Sometimes it's just too much time, right? Some people want to retire super young, and that's great, but that's also one of the highest risk decisions they can make, because the longer the retirement lasts, the greater the period of uncertainty. And then otherwise, I think risks not being properly managed, and that's sort of on an upside risk and a downside risk. Some people are too conservative with their investments or how they save, and they don't take the appropriate risk necessary to overcome costs of things like inflation. Or conversely, sometimes people ignore everyday risks like, their home, their auto, basic things that they can insure, disability, life insurance, long-term care, etc. And those just sort of become lurking landmines in their financial plan.
All right. Sounds pretty simple then, right? Overspending, maybe even underspending, too much time to fund some of these goals and a lifestyle. When these things tend to occur, do you think folks know it and they're saying, I'm just living my life and I know I'm on a plan for failure? Or do you think it happens without their knowledge and then one day they realize they're screwed?
It's interesting. I think most people don't have a plan. And I say that sort of advisedly as a financial planner, right? Lots of people come to us. We say, why are you here? They say, like, we're doing the right stuff, quote marks, or we got started later in life, or we haven't gotten started at all. It just depends on who they are and where they are. And we're worried that we don't know that we're on track or that we're going to be able to retire or be comfortable or achieve our goals or whatever is important to them. So I think the majority of people we talk to, and bear in mind, right, our client base skews towards the professionally accomplished, skews towards people with higher incomes, skews towards people with more assets, more wealth already. So on paper, they might look great, but then there's still an underlying question of, hey, just because you're making $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year as a household doesn't mean that your expenses are commensurately appropriate or that you've done the right kind of saving and investing to fund your lifestyle later on. So that's sort of the issue. And then the other issue is that a lot of people, even if they do have a plan, are not very good at following it. And that's where sort of accountability becomes a big issue in financial planning.
All right, so whether it's a lack of plan or just a plan they won't follow, do you think these are behavioral issues?
I think avoidance is a really popular financial behavior as far as sort of destructive or non-constructive behaviors. We also have a lot of social taboos, right? It's not polite to talk about money. It's not polite to ask somebody how much they make, or to talk about how much you make, or you should not talk about money because you'll make other people embarrassed or feel bad. So you have a lot of like social taboos that sort of suggest to people that thinking or talking or discussing money are all bad things. And the problem is that that's not a constructive mindset. You have to be able to talk about a problem to be able to resolve or solve that problem. And so avoidance is sort of a default behavior for a lot of people.
Yes. Yeah, and we say some semblance of this from time to time, right? Everybody actually does have a financial plan. Some of them are intentional, and the remainder of them are unintentional, where you're just blindly doing things and following trends, or just on autopilot with no real course of action. But everybody does have a plan. How do we as financial planners, get more people to, whether it's with us or just in general, emphasize and understand the importance of having a legitimate plan?
I mean, the basic metaphor I'd use here is if you're in a car traveling, it sure helps to have your eyes open, hands on the wheel, know where your destination is, be able to see the obstacles in the way, etc. What a lot of people are doing is driving with their eyes closed, right? They are making money, spending money, saving, maybe investing somehow, and they're not thinking about how all those things are going to aggregate to a positive or a negative outcome. It is not uncommon for us to talk to people in their 50s or 60s who essentially start the conversation with, I wish we had had this conversation sooner. I wish we had talked to a financial advisor, financial planner, or whatever they're thinking of, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But we haven't, and now we're here, and now we have concerns. And that's not to say that everybody listening to this who's under the age of 40 needs to rush out and go to our website and schedule a consult, but it's just to point out that, to your explanation, right? Everybody has a financial plan, whether it's deliberately constructed or not. There are plans that are constructed and designed in such a way to effectuate a specific outcome, and where we have those benchmarks to say we're on track, we're ahead of track, we're behind track. And then there's a ton of financial plans where the plan is to just do positive financial behaviors, maybe consistently, maybe over time, and hope that it works out.
Yeah, we see it all the time, and it's one of my least favorite things to hear. It's the, wow, I should have started this 10, 15 years ago. And that being said, I like to say, right, the best time to plant an apple tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So while people might have, put something off longer than they would have liked to, the second best time to start is today. So you said, right, people can take consistent actions towards some of these goals once they kind of realize this is something they need to do. So we can put a plan in place for a client, and everything can be well and good for 6 months, maybe a year. They're starting to fire on all cylinders. But every once in a while, you see people start to kind of deviate from the plan a little bit. Or to use your analogy, maybe they were driving for a while and then started to get a little drowsy or fall asleep at the wheel. So I guess, what are some warning signs maybe you or I, or even just folks in general, can kind of watch for to indicate that maybe their plan is starting to drift off track a little bit?
You actually mentioned something that a client said to us recently, I think on the last podcast, and it was essentially, I come in here every quarter all the time, and I ask you guys the same questions, and you gave me the same answers, and that is valuable. Like that is working. That is proving to be something useful in my case, even though I keep asking the question, even though you keep giving the same answers. And that sort of hints at kind of where the most common examples of problems or things that are going to take you off track in your plan arise, which is financial plans thrive on regular review and consistent execution. It is about consistent saving. It's about consistent investing. It's about consistent risk management. It's about planning ahead rather than letting emergencies become things that dictate short-term behaviors. And so what often indicates a plan that is going to run into trouble or fail is essentially one-offs, right? Well, we have an emergency fund, but we decided we were going to dip into it for this big vacation that wasn't otherwise in the budget. We had money set aside for this home renovation, but instead we decided to do that. Or, we didn't talk to you first. We didn't ask or discuss it with you, but by the way, we just got a new car just 'cause. So it's these things that are not part of the plan, not executed, that are sort of these, little onesie-twosie things that were not really on the agenda, where suddenly, despite the fact that they might otherwise not be a big deal on their own, The challenge is that we have sort of short memories for one-off events, right? We are good at rationalizing individual occasions and occurrences. And so when a plan is in its practice or in its execution is being better defined by these one-off events than by systematic saving, systematic investing, systematic behaviors, right? And sticking to that sort of an orderly way of approaching problems and accumulating wealth, that's a pretty big red flag that somebody is going to run into problems down the road.
It sounds like you're mainly speaking to, I guess, deviations from spending patterns for these one-off events, right? It's kind of like a diet. I hold myself accountable to a diet. Every once in a while, I'll kind of realize, oh yeah, I ate out a little bit more this week than maybe I intended. So it's good to kind of have that periodic review and check-in. Something you didn't really touch on, I think that also happens over time is just change in priorities, right? Hey, I wanted to save for my kids' college. They're not going to college anymore. And maybe that changes some of the plan, right? And that requires different assumptions in things as well. Or maybe somebody wants to retire considerably earlier and maybe doesn't take into consideration the impact that actually has on a plan, because now they're not saving and they're withdrawing from assets instead. And that happens more often than I think people realize.
Well, and that's sort of even a thing that's like ironically positive, right? Oh, my kid's not going to go to college. From a financial plan standpoint, that's great for your financial plan. You're not going to have to spend all this money on college. But I think about something like even a recent case we've dealt with where we've had these a married couple. They're in retirement age. They are both retired at this point. And when we started working with them 5 or 6 years ago, we highlighted the risks of long-term care and the potential need to get some insurance for that or something. And they kind of, it seems kind of expensive. We're not sure that we're going to need it. So we'll just go ahead and self-insure. Fast forward to this year and suddenly, and I don't know what's caused this. I'm guessing there's maybe been a undisclosed health scare or event or something's happened with a family member where now they're seeing how expensive and how challenging long-term care can be. But whatever it is, suddenly they're very interested in solving that problem. And I'll tell you, we're having a heck of a time finding a solution for them. There's essentially no traditional long-term care policy that they're eligible for based on their age. And the asset-based solutions that are out there are so expensive that they will effectively derail the retirement part of the retirement plan. So it's this issue where sometimes, changing circumstances and goals can be beneficial, right? Hey, we're not going to, start that business, or we're not going to pay for college, or whatever it is. And that, more money, good sort of simplistic view of financial planning shows up in a positive way. Other times it's, hey, we planned around disability, we had disability insurance, and suddenly now I'm ill or injured and I cannot work, and now the hypothetical of disability is turning into our reality, and that's changing the direction of our life path and how we have to function within our financial plan.
Those conversations are no fun because we had the ability to do something about it in the past, and the time to maybe solve it most optimally is no longer here. Are there times when things like that, which I don't want to maybe consider a failure, but are there parts of the plan sometimes that quote unquote fail that end up leading to maybe better outcomes or kind of lessons learned?
There's an old expression, and this is more of an investor's thing, but there's an old expression that every dollar you've ever lost on a bad investment is as money spent on your investment education. And this usually has to do with like Hail Mary bets, right? Well, we're going to pile into this company because it can't possibly fail. It's going to the moon. And then, oops, no, it didn't. And don't we feel silly? The sort of interesting thing about that is there's plenty of life events that can be absolutely worth their weight in gold with respect to sort of, financial planning circumstances and so on. I can't begin to count the number of clients over the years. And I hate to pick on the gentleman, but it is once again always the gentleman. But I can't begin to count the number of clients who have, kind of gotten into crypto and they start sending me emails or screenshots like, wow, like I made 46% today. Like I'm super good at this. Like what, Dan, no offense, but you've only done 15% in the last year or two. Like, why are we not doing more of this crypto stuff? And then those messages at some point in the next, 6 months, year, 2 years will suddenly kind of stop and go away. And at some point I'll bring up, hey, how is that going? They'll be like, well, kind of the hat will go in the hands. They'll kind of get sheepish and they'll go, hey, I made a lot and then I lost a lot and I'm kind of no better off than I was to begin with. I'm like, well, at least you didn't lose your entire life savings or do anything super crazy with this on the upside. But on the other end of that, you sure gained a lesson in investing, right? And sort of how speculative risk can look really good in short-term periods and then can go really badly in short-term periods. So all that to say, I think, a lot of the quote-unquote mistakes that people make in their financial journey can be really valuable so long as they're willing to learn from them and apply better habits going forward.
It's your favorite school of lessons learned, right?
It teaches the best classes.
Yeah, kind of on that note, I think I opened my first brokerage account when I was like 18 years old. And, ignorant 18-year-old, I think I'm a junior in college at this point. And I remember I went to the sauna at the gym, and there's this guy in there who's clearly double, triple my age, talking about some random stock and talking it up, how if this thing goes through, this and that, it's going to take off. So me, as an 18-year-old, right, decided to look into it as this guy's talking about it. And I don't even think the company's around today. I think they went out of business. So at least I was able to learn, the lesson maybe about taking speculation into account for, long-term investments is probably not all that wise, especially with, amounts you're maybe not comfortable losing, I'd say.
You got to start hanging out in different saunas. I feel like every time you talk about meeting a guy in the sauna, he's just got the world's worst advice. He's right up there with brother-in-laws and college roommates.
Yeah, there's a trend here.
And, much love and respect to my brothers-in-law, and for that matter, to my sisters-in-law, since I'm the brother-in-law in this conversation. I do know what I'm doing.
So I have a couple of rules of thumbs listed here in the financial planning community that we tend to hear from time to time. Wrote a couple of them down. Thought I'd, list them out for you here so we can talk about them, see where it makes sense to apply. But then, as they are rules of thumb, also kind of just play the devil's advocate a little. Say, okay, well, this is sage advice maybe for the majority of people, if at all. When is it not actually good advice? Because the thing about financial planning is, even with rules of thumb, there's always an exception where it doesn't make sense to do that thing. That's why almost every answer we give somebody is, it depends. So I'm just going to list a couple out here. Having an emergency fund, the 4% rule, high interest debt and avoiding it, buying is better than renting, diversifying your investments, and then always taking your 401k match.
Okay, I mean, though there are definitely rules of thumb applied to all of those. So, and some of them are essentially self-descriptive rules of thumb. I guess hit me with emergency fund. What's the rule as you understand it, and how do we need to address it?
All right, so without getting into maybe the nuance of if you're self-employed, have variable income, dual spousal income, or single spouse income, usually 3 to 6 months of living expenses is wise to have in an emergency fund. Agree?
Generally agree, but I think the specifics do matter here because 3 months and 6 months are very different amounts of money for a lot of people. So basic guideline here, if you are the sole breadwinner, sole income earner in your household, we probably, in a perfect world, want to have 6 months. I think the necessity of 6 months versus 3 months or somewhere in between depends on whether there are people depending on you. If it's just yourself versus you, your spouse, your kids, that sort of thing, then more money, better. I think in a dual income household, it is going to make more sense to have two incomes and at least 3 months there. And if you have highly correlated jobs, right, you both work at the same company or something, then probably closer to that 6 months just for safety because layoffs happen, right? Amazon literally yesterday announced they're laying off 10% of their white collar workforce. So there's examples like that where we have to go, okay, like there's a meaningful importance to making sure that we are covering our bases there. And then, I think the only other thing that really matters here in a serious sense is the definition of months. Are we talking about 3 months of bare bones expenses like mortgage payment, insurance, groceries, gas, that's it? Or are we talking about full quality of life? I think full quality of life is preferable because if you need your emergency fund for something like you got laid off, you're already going to be going through a lot of stress and it's a lot to put on you to say, hey, not only did you lose your job and I need to go get another job, but also you need to, cut back on your lifestyle. So in a perfect world, 6 months, full quality of life. In a bare bones world, 3 months, bare bones minimums.
Do you recommend against having an emergency fund?
Not against having it unless, there's end of life scenarios. Hey, I've got terminal cancer. I've got 3 months to live. Time to go live it up. Hey, more power to you. I think otherwise the inverse problem exists sometimes. We do occasionally come across people who have hundreds of thousands of dollars essentially in high yield savings, and maybe they needed $50,000 to $100,000 as a 6-month full lifestyle emergency fund. And in those scenarios, then it's just like, hey, you've got way too much buffer here. And so to that extent, you're kind of off an optimal mix of how much cash you have versus stock versus home equity versus fixed income and so on. And we've got to find more productive ways to deploy some of this capital.
I think we see that a lot. People just accumulate cash for no reason, and then we have to tell them what an adequate amount is. But I think I kind of agree with you. Rarely, if ever, am I going to tell somebody don't have an emergency fund. So I think out of all of these we'll discuss here, that might be the one that's almost always going to be applicable to folks.
Well, and here's the wild thing, right? When we think about emergency funds, most people are going to think about like checking, savings, maybe a money market account or something like that. That's kind of where most people are going to go to. I have seen people with literally $2-3 million in cash, like just it sitting in a checking account, not even earning interest before. So it's something where, that sounds crazy to most people listening to this. I fully recognize that. But that is a real thing, right? Inertia can be a really big problem for emergency funds, either on the side of not accumulating and getting one in place, and conversely on the other side, having kind of just not really taken the time to be deliberate about how you're deploying your capital.
4% rule. The way I understand it, just very high level, is, there was a study done a few years ago that took I want to say 60-40 portfolio and said, if you withdraw 4% from this account annually, it's going to grow enough every single year over time that you'll never run out of money, essentially. And that's kind of the optimal sweet spot from a percentage to take advantage of your retirement and, not deplete the portfolio by the time you're 85. Sound about right?
Well, and I think you described the popular misconception version of it. So this is one where I'm going to put this more as a myth than as a reality. So first and foremost, 4% rule is not a rule. It's a research finding. It's a research finding by a gentleman named Bill Bengen. He has updated it over the last several decades. I think his original finding was like in the late 90s, the early 2000s, but he updates it all the time. And so the 4% rule has been as high as like the 5.3 rule. It's been as low as the 3.2 rule. It moves all the time because what it is it's looking at, based on that sort of portfolio mix, what it has been a historically sustainable withdrawal rate for something like a 20-year retirement. And the problem is what a lot of people hear or read in like an article somewhere is you can distribute 4% of your savings and you'll never run out of money. Okay, that is not intrinsically true. Sequence of returns risk is there. Inflation risk can be a real factor here. And this presupposes that you have investments that are aligned, right? We say 60-40, but there's plenty of ways to construct a 60-40 portfolio. So all this to say, like it's a lovely rule of thumb in like the true traditional sense of a rule of thumb, and it is a terribly unreliable tool to base your retirement distribution strategy on.
Yeah, not to mention the actual location of your assets and what that means from a tax perspective, right? Big difference between a lot of after-tax money in Roth and all your money in pre-tax, and you have a ticking time bomb for maybe RMDs. That's going to change things kind of considerably too.
A terrific observation on your point, right? 4% net of tax versus 4% pre-tax, very different quality of life, very different amount of expenditure, very different tax ramifications.
All right. Buying is better than renting, Dan. When I buy, I'm working toward owning an asset. That asset's going to appreciate over time. But when I rent, I'm just throwing my money away. I'm not buying anything. I don't have an asset. It's just a large expense. You can't convince me otherwise.
I can't convince you? Au contraire, sir. I think the basic element here is number one, there is just time, right? The real estate in something like purchasing a house, condo, townhome, whatever, comes with transaction costs. There, even if you represent yourself on the buy side and the sell side and all that, there's going to be transaction costs. It typically is going to take somebody 5 to 7 years of appreciation and amortization on their loan to reach break even with the transaction costs of buying in and selling out of a property. So if I'm only going to be somewhere for 6 months, a year, 2 years, it does not make sense to buy simply because I'm going to incur substantially greater costs on the exit than I otherwise would. Some people will then make the argument, well, you just buy and then you move and you rent it out. Well, great, but now you are a landlord and business owner and you have to deal with all the complications with that. That could be good or bad in your case. On the other side of that, right, renting is a low liability activity. I have a payment. as long as I don't trash the place, that payment is essentially all I'm going to be in this property for. So yes, I'm not potentially accumulating value or equity. I'm also avoiding substantial amounts of the potential liability. I'm avoiding substantial amounts of the financial responsibility. I'm avoiding transaction costs. So this is not to say that renting is superior, but I think timeline is a huge factor. And then it's also, just to be clear, very easy and very possible to overpay for real estate. We have clients who have Airbnb type properties in different places in the country, and some are making money and some are losing, $1,000, $2,000 a month on the fact that they sort of bought during a very high interest, high hype period in the marketplace, those types of properties. And between the mortgage rates they're paying and how much they had to pay in the first place, they're not able to rent it at a rate that actually makes the money. So there's a lot of potential issues with purchasing, whereas renting, we have a fixed cost as a general rule, for a fixed period of time that we can reassess. Long term, I think buying is going to be better than renting, but there's a lot of factors in the under 10 years time period that need to be accounted for before buying makes sense.
Yeah, I don't even know if this one's a rule, because you can find people that say the exact opposite, but I needed to sneak it in there. And I think it's ridiculous, frankly. It doesn't even take into consideration, job security, right? If I rent, I probably figure out a way to get out of the lease. It might be expensive, but I'll be okay. If you have a mortgage, you're locked into that baby, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to just get out of the mortgage. Someone who maybe doesn't have job security or doesn't have, confidence they're going to be in a location for a while, take on such a substantial and, important burden. It just kind of blows my mind that so many people see the nuance in this conversation and are just one way or another.
Well, yeah, here's a really good example, right? You and I have a CPA friend through the world of tax Twitter, who I think, I don't have the exact numbers here, right? But, she posted recently that she and her husband paid essentially $60,000 in interest for their house last year, which, in the Denver market suggests maybe they bought something close to $1 million house and, have something like a 6% mortgage. That's nuts, right? That's a huge amount of money going away on interest. And they could, right? Not are, but could potentially just be renting an apartment, a townhome, a condo, something like that for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month. Still a lot of money, but they would not have had, essentially $5,000 a month going away into interest. So there's just a lot of factors that go into this. I wish it was more straightforward, but it just isn't. It's a complicated calculus.
Yeah, it really is. So diversify your investments, Dan. Spread everything out. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's the safest and surest way to build wealth over the long term. Sound about right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, when you say the safest way, I think that is almost certainly the case. Diversification removes essentially kind of non-systematic risk. So, if all my money is in one company, I have risks related to that company's profits, its losses, its operations, its management, regulatory issues, all the things that go with that. And you hear about people who bought Apple stock or Chipotle or Google or Amazon in the early days. We've got a client out there who has something like $200,000 in Amazon stock, and I think their cost basis is like $600. Great, incredible returns. But that's just sort of the truism, right? Diversification reduces risk at the cost of potential upsides, and concentration, increases risk dramatically at the potential value of, disproportionate or substantial returns. So it's just a question of your objectives. I'm a financial planner. I don't own a single individual stock. I don't own a single fund with less than several hundred holdings in it. So I'm clearly on the wealth accumulation side, a big fan of diversification over concentration, but that's not going to mean that that's the appropriate recipe for everybody.
To play the devil's advocate a little bit here, what if we have like a business owner client and I'm making this up for the example, they look at their business and over the last 10 years, every year they've grown by 20%. And then they say, well, I know my business considerably better than I know the market. I'm going to reinvest in this business where I can likely earn, say, 20% per year instead of putting it in the market and diversifying my investments. I know my business and I know it better than I'll ever know any investment I invest in elsewhere. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I can use myself as a really good example of this. So, because I'm sort of your use case here. 2 years ago, I had the practice formally valued by a certified business appraiser. And essentially, they came back and said, hey, your practice is worth about $1.2 million. And I said, cool, good to know. 2 years later, the valuation, the most recent one back in July came in, it's worth 2.6, 2.7. So in 2 years, it more than doubled in value. It would be very easy for me to say, scratch the 401k, scratch the Roth, scratch it all. I'm just going to pour money into this business enterprise. But what that is, and there's a specific term for this, is the illusion of control, right? So when you describe somebody who, I know my business, I know how it works, I know how to make it profitable, and so on and so forth, that presupposes that knowledge is the same thing as the ability to effectuate an outcome. And so, I think for business owners, actually, even more than everyday people, it's actually even more important to diversify. I think one of the most common demographics that gives me kind of the greatest concern about this are folks like realtors, where realtors will make all their money from real estate transactions, and then they will turn around and use their real estate license to buy rental or investment properties, and that's terrific. But they then take that, and now we have all of our income coming from one asset class. We have all of our expenses baked into this asset class, and all of our investments and money are in this asset class. So it's something where, for me, right, I could say a huge amount of my net worth is in the value of this practice, and that's great. But I also do not reinvest, quote unquote, into the practice as an investment strategy other than the money and capital I leave in the business to keep it running and help it grow. All of my investing is being done in ultra diversified things. And I think that's very important for a business owner, because even though your business is probably going to be the highest risk, highest reward thing you do in your life and your career, you've got to be mindful that if you're not taking money out of the business over time and building wealth outside of the business, that you are taking on an enormous amount of risk.
That's really good. Thanks. All right, last one here. Always take advantage of your 401k match. It's free money. It's part of your employment package that they're giving it to you. By not doing so, you are literally leaving money your employer is willing to pay you on the table.
I have a hard time finding cases where this isn't a true sort of rule of thumb to apply. I think usually when it doesn't apply, there's some sort of emergency circumstance going on. Hey, I'm going to get evicted. I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage. My kid just had a big emergency medical bill and we need to pay for care or something like that. So, I think as a, 99% of the time case, it is foolish not to take the match, because we're talking about getting, 50, 100% return on our money pretty much instantaneously. But outside of that, there are some select circumstances where I don't think that rule of thumb applies.
Like what?
The aforementioned emergency circumstances.
Nothing else, really? What about, if you think you're going to leave a job in 2 years and you know that their matching contributions won't vest?
I think that's a pretty obvious case where you just go, okay, there's a cliff vesting schedule. I'm going to be out sooner than later, so then I might as well not. We could even look at something where there is vesting and it's just a question of where you allocate. So look at you, for example. We have a 6% match in the 401k here. The default contribution when somebody gets enrolled in the 401k is 10% unless they choose something else. So they're getting matched on 6, they're getting 12, but then there's another 4 going in, total of 16 if they just use the default. And when you started, you said, should I do that? And it's no, not necessarily in your case, because your income was below the threshold where you can still do Roth contributions. There's some costs in the 401k plan that you incur just by being a participant in it. So really, in your case, it makes sense to do 6%, get your match of 6%, and then take the 4% you'd save otherwise and put it somewhere else. So there's certain cases like that. But again, within the scope of the match to match dollar, where it's 1 for 1 or one for 50 cents on the dollar, that's something where, again, it's a pretty niche case where unless you're not going to get it, or that there's a bigger opportunity cost by not allocating those dollars elsewhere, it's just very silly not to participate. I also think that, unless you are certain you are not going to vest, for a fact your contract ends too soon, or that you will absolutely be moving, changing jobs, whatever, then I think a lot of people can rationalize not saving for retirement. And that sort of becomes one of those, financial plans people haven't made deliberately, but are living with scenarios that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I'm really picking out niche little cases here to try to get an answer out of you, but I just don't think there's a lot there. I think take it. There are going to be cases where you shouldn't, but I think that's pretty sage advice for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. There is no perfect plan.
That's interesting. You said there's no such thing as a perfect plan, which is a wonderful segue into the third topic here, which is why you shouldn't chase a perfect financial plan. You said it before, right? Chasing perfection is essentially the enemy of good. But really, there's no such thing as a perfect plan. Nobody has it all figured out.
No, I mean, just point blank, no. Anybody who tells you they can sell you certainty is just selling you a lie. We are, as financial planners, right, we are forecasting. All of finance relies on forecasting, relies on certain assumptions, discounting for risks, and that the net of the positive sides of the assumptions and the discounting for risks works out. And the general process is that, you will be imprecisely, approximately in the correct area if you've done your work correctly. That does not account for black swan events, right? Some people saw 2007, 2008 happening, but not enough people. Some people saw COVID, coming, but not enough people. Like, there's always room for these kind of big one-time asymmetrical risk events to happen that are going to derail your plan. But like, for example, when we build our plans, we typically build them with about 1.5% more inflation on expenses than we do on the positive inflation for things like raises, salaries, and income. We do that to create a conservative buffer because we don't know what inflation will be perfectly forever. And we could use the long-term average, 3.3%, 100-year average, then that might be conservative enough. But we like to build our plans with a buffer so that things are more likely to work out than not, even if things go worse than we were otherwise anticipating within real numbers, as opposed to that big 1.5% extra buffer. Like that's just sort of the thing about forecasting is the more certain you are, the more probable it is that you are wrong. Whereas we build around general success and kind of create certain degrees of resistance to failure, that is much more likely to work out for you.
Those all sound like assumptions, forecasts, and maybe things out of our control that would make a plan less than perfect. But how about this? Are there any plans that are perfect given to the things that are within a client's control?
I think you can have a perfect execution of a plan in a short-term period, assuming nothing goes wrong, right? So you save the amount you're supposed to save, you're getting the appropriate level of risk in your portfolio, you insure away the risks as much as you can, and then nothing bad happens. Like, I think there's kind of point-to-point surety. This is something where I kind of think about how I was trained to do land navigation in the Army, which is you get this map of an area that might be like 5 by 5 or 10 by 10 miles, huge area. And you are plotting points on the map, and you are then looking at the map and figuring out what roads you're going to follow or valleys you're going to go over. What you don't do in that process is you don't draw a line from where you start to where you want to go as a straight line and then pull out your compass and say, okay, I'm going to go to 297 degrees and I'm going to walk for 2.9 kilometers. And every 63 steps I take with my left foot is 100 meters. So I just need to do 63 times 29 and I'll land exactly where I'm supposed to. That's not how you do it, right? You have to build your overall plan, your overall strategy, and then you have to take these incremental small Johnson journeys and then reshoot that azimuth, right? It was 297. I drifted a little bit to the left. Now it's going to be 300. I've gone now 400 meters more. Turns out that I overshot. My angle was slightly off when I read my compass, when I looked at my landmarks. Now I've ended up a little bit too far off to the right. So it's more about this repetitious behavior of acquiring a target, moving towards it, getting there, recognizing where you are. Are we ahead of target? Are we behind target? Too far to the right, too far to the left, right? Readjusting our direction, our expectations, traveling again, making progress again, arriving at another destination, reshooting and recycling and so on until we do arrive at the destination we're looking to arrive at, or along our travel, realize that our original plan was not perfect, was not going to work out in the first place. We failed to identify an obstacle. And now we need to make a new plan or completely readjust our course or our potential objectives. And that could be life changes or circumstances. That could be risks that came to pass that we were just very confident were not going to come to pass. There's a million reasons it can change. But there is no straight line from point A to point B in life.
All right. Well, as someone who maybe considers themselves a perfectionist, how should they view this? What should be their North Star if it's not chasing perfection? Should it be chasing good enough, chasing the best they can do?
I think there's two gradients of this. There's the element of chasing perfection can be a kind of a waste of time, right? Making the perfect spreadsheet, making the perfect plan, making the perfect portfolio such that you can over-invest in the time costs and therefore the opportunity costs of building that perfect plan such that maybe your plan is perfect, but what costs do you incur making it perfect? Or, and I think this is the more realistic version, using perfection as an excuse to rationalize non-productive behaviors, right? Well, I would save, I would invest, but until I have the perfect savings plan, until I have the perfect portfolio, I'm not going to save and invest because it would be foolish to save my money into an imperfect thing. right? But even recognize that when we think it's perfect, when we finally come to the, decision, right? This is the perfect decision for me. It still rests on assumptions. We assume it is perfect. We do not know for a fact that it is perfect. And I think that is where, again, perfect becomes the enemy of good.
All right. Well, I think that wraps it up for me this week, Dan.
Not so fast, sir, because as you know, we have to ask, what is it you've learned in the last couple of weeks that you want to share with our audience that they would benefit from learning about?
Yeah, I'm going to do something related to the current hiring process we're going through. So for anybody that, is maybe doing some research and decided to listen to a podcast episode and actually made it to the end, this might benefit you. Now, I'll make it pretty short, actually. You can sound incredibly more intelligent if you just put an incremental amount of preparation into interviews, into resumes, cover letters above everybody else, and that will have an outsized return on your career trajectory and job opportunities. I think everybody does a very surface level of preparation. They look at the website, they might, research the people that work at the company. Maybe they ask a friend to give them a mock interview. If you just ask yourself, is there anybody that interviewed for this position, whether I know them or not, who likely prepared more than me? If you can say the answer to that question is, yeah, there's probably a bunch, you're not preparing enough. You need to go into these interviews, if you really want the job, preparing or at least thinking you prepared more than everybody else. You'll hold your head up a little higher, you'll talk a little clearer, and you'll stand a little straighter. And to be honest with you, if you put in an average amount of effort, don't be surprised if you get an average or below average job.
I think that's terrific advice. And for anybody who doesn't know this, Daniel here is quite possibly a world-class job seeker. When he applied for our position, just off his resume alone, I sent him an email and was like, hey, you're aware this is an entry-level planning analyst job, right? You understand you are heads and shoulders ahead of the pack just on the resume level alone. He's like, yep. Wrote back a terrific explanation of what he was looking for and why. When we get to the interview phase, right, is polished, communicates well, has clear, concise, thoughtful answers to every single question, right? I mean, just absolutely can crush it. So if there's anybody to listen to on how to do well at interviewing or how to do well at applying for jobs, Daniel Stefanski here is your man.
It's amazing. I've been able to keep that act going for almost 2 years now.
Dude, you are possibly the most polished human being of all time. It's absurd.
All right. Well, I'll take that. Thanks, Dan.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed in the podcast is appropriate for every individual and every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.